of student loan debt. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So, although this is a discussion about student loan debt, which is part of the launch of the Emancipator, it is part of my Racial Wealth Gap series, the breaking news last night about a purported majority opinion that is going to knock down Roe versus Wade is obviously of the utmost importance, not only to the news in general, but to the issue of economic and racial justice. And so, in response to that, the first half of today's chat, I'm actually going to talk to the Congresswoman about that and its implications. And in the second half, we will get to our discussion and about eliminating student loan debt. Because of the shortness of time and the just breadth of things that we want to get to today, we will not be able to take audience questions, but I will do my best to cover the ground as thoroughly as possible. So I want to start with this decision in Dobbs, Congresswoman, this purported 5-justice majority that not only will strike down Roe versus Wade, but really eviscerates the legal precedent on which it's based. What is your initial reaction to it?
Fear and devastating confirmation of exactly what myself and many other repro justice, abortion care advocates, especially those serving our most marginalized Black and Brown communities, we feared a moment like this could come, but I think it's important to state that it is a draft, it is not a ruling. Let me just make this emphatically clear that Roe v. Wade is still the law of the land. And if you have already made an appointment, you should follow through and keep your appointment. Abortion is still legal in Massachusetts. There are abortion funds, clinics, and supportive networks that are here to help you. So again, if you need care, do not cancel your appointment. Please reach out to your provider immediately. But again, it's just a sobering confirmation and par for the course with this Supreme Court in its current iteration, given the imbalance and the far right extremism, and they have obstructed the will of the people on so many issues of consequence, from voting rights to housing rights to bodily autonomy and reproductive justice.
I want you to talk a little bit more, and you mentioned Massachusetts. Massachusetts is one of the minority states in the United States that does have a Roe Act, which protects abortion access, but the majority of states in the country do not have that. And so if Roe v. Wade, if this opinion is real and it holds, if it's struck down, for a lot of those places, there will immediately be a lack of access. Talk a little bit about what that impact might be. Having a Roe Act or not having a Roe Act on the ground, what difference that could make.
Well, let me just say for those in Massachusetts, what we will experience, even with the Roe Act being law of the land here, is that there will be a spillover. And it's exactly why providers need to be on the ready, because for those states who do not have state laws codifying access to abortion care, they will be coming here. So there will be a spillover and a residual effect. And then for those states, again, this is currently a draft, but if it becomes a ruling, and for those states that do not have a Roe Act, something codifying abortion care on the state level, it doesn't mean that people will stop having abortions. We've seen that with the draconian state laws passed in Texas and Mississippi. Abortion bans do not stop people from getting abortions. It just means that what you're putting out of reach is they're having the ability to have an abortion that is legal and that is safe. And so that is why, Kimberly, it's really incumbent upon us to organize and mobilize and legislate as if lives depend on it, because they quite literally do. Some months ago, the House did pass my legislation in partnership with Representative Judy Chu, the Women's Health Protection Act, also known as WIPA. And so, we're calling on the Senate to take this up and to codify abortion care and Roe v. Wade on the federal level, and of course to ban the introduction of any harmful draconian state bans. But there's been a precise, ongoing, coordinated attack against what has been settled law.
And you mentioned the Women's Health Protection Act. In the language of that act, it references what you just said, a phrase that what you just said, which is reproductive justice. I think many in our audience has heard the term reproductive rights, but reproductive justice is something different. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. Well, I think the point here is that we don't want anyone to be denied access to healthcare, and abortion is healthcare. And we know that our most marginalized, because of things like the Hyde Amendment, just as an example, Black and Brown communities have disproportionately been denied access. And so, the point here is that access to healthcare, and abortion care is healthcare, should be equitably accessed by all, and no one should be denied based on geography, race, or socioeconomic status.
And it does have a disproportionate impact. Actually, Black women in America, as you know, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy for a pregnancy-related complication than white women in America. So when it comes to access to abortion care, often that can be life-saving for the woman who is pregnant, yet in many of these laws do not have a life or health of the mother exception. I was struck by a footnote in this purported opinion by Justice Samuel Alito, which seemed to claim that this ruling, the striking down of Roe v. Wade, would actually be protective to Black people because he says, in his words, a disproportionate percentage of abortions are performed on Black women. He actually didn't word it that way. He didn't talk about the women at all. He said something like the disproportionate percentage of Black fetuses are aborted. If you were reacting to that, what would you say about the impact on Black communities of the overturning of Roe v. Wade?
The thing here, Kimberly, I'm just sitting with that, what you just said. The roots of the anti-abortion movement, like abortion bans, are rooted in white supremacy. And they really do perpetuate these cycles of poverty and economic inequality and exacerbate many of our starkest health disparities. But I would just say that, Black women have disproportionately also been the victims of medical apartheid, with forced hysterectomies and sterilizations and things like that. And again, when it comes to healthcare access, low income and the most marginalized communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous, often face the biggest barriers. And so that's why it is important, since this is a matter of life and death, to your point that you stated earlier, that we are organizing, mobilizing, and legislating as if lives depend on it, because they do. The House passed the Women's Health Protection Act months ago, and the Senate should have already taken it up, but they must act swiftly.
When you came into Congress, there wasn't, you helped initiate a greater focus on Black maternal health care. I think for some of our audience, there may not be a clear nexus, despite the fact that a majority of Americans support upholding Roe and keeping abortion legal in America. There may not be a full understanding as to what part that plays in maternal health care in general and Black maternal health care specifically. Can you help draw that line between the two?
Well, first, I'd just like to uplift the point that you said there around the majority of Americans. I mean, louder for the people in the back. Again, that's why this latest, this draft, and what we fear will become a formal ruling and law, and turning back the clock of the hands of time here, is obstructing the will of the people, because the majority of Americans do support Roe v. Wade, again, which has been a settled law. To your point around the Black maternal morbidity crisis, I've got a foot on both sides of this. So this is the first pro-choice majority Congress in the history of Congress. I chair the Abortion Rights and Access Task Force under our pro-choice caucus. And then I'm a founding member of the Black Maternal Health Caucus under the Congressional Black Caucus. And of course, we have a suite of bills we've been working through the House in our momnibus. And one of those bills is my bill, the Mommy's Act, to address the Black maternal morbidity crisis. It is unconscionable. My grandmother died in the 1950s, my paternal grandmother giving birth to my father's youngest brother. And in 2022, Black women are still 4 times more likely to die while giving birth or in post-birthing complications. So some of the things that we've offered in that regard are that doulas would be covered by insurance, that we would extend postpartum coverage to a full year when we often see many of those complications arise. And it's also why with Representative Barbara Lee, we introduced my bill, the Anti-Racism and Public Health Act, because what we know is that the pain of Black women is often erased or delegitimized, and it is costing us our lives. There is a systemic embedded bias, a belief that we have higher thresholds for pain, and so when Black birthing people have been in distress, their distress has fallen on deaf ears, resulting in near fatal complications or in death. So, at the end of the day, all of this is about ensuring access to the best care, the best health care, the best prenatal maternal care, just the best health care. And again, abortion care is health care, no matter or where you live, what your race is, or your socioeconomic status. And we've been sounding the alarm for a very long time. The Women's Health Protection Act is a piece of legislation that has been reintroduced every Congress since 2013, because there was a fear that we would come to this day, given the precise and coordinated attacks that have been taking place on the state level.
One question that I often receive from people when news like this breaks is, what can be done? What can Americans who are concerned about a potential of a ruling like this, about its impact, do? And lately, in the past few years, that's been an addition has been added to that, which is besides vote. We've been told to vote, but clearly voting isn't enough because we vote and these things keep happening. What would you advise members of the American public who want to protect access to abortion and who are concerned about reproductive justice and racial justice when it comes to healthcare? What should they do?
Well, I would urge everyone, do not make assumptions about, where your senators stand. But even if you do assume that they share your commitment, please call them and lobby them for the Senate to take up the Women's Health Protection Act so that we can make this federal law. I think it's important that you are lobbying and calling every elected official and making it known that this is a priority of yours so that we can move with urgency. On this issue and so many others, recently someone had said I was impatient. And, I said, patience is a methodology of the privileged. I'm moving with urgency because I understand that these policies are the difference between surviving, living, or thriving. And so I would encourage people to, again, lobby their senators so that we can get this as federal law. And then also to be supportive of grassroots organizing efforts for abortion funds. Again, we want to ready ourselves in the event that this does become more than a draft, that anyone who is in need will still be able to get the care that they need. And so again, the Roe Act is settled law here in Massachusetts, but we will see spillover and people coming from states from all over the country who do not have state laws guaranteeing them access to abortion care. And so they're going to need support, logistic support, transportation, and the like. And so these abortion funds not only support the actual abortion care, but are most marginalized and their ability to get to that care and to be able to access it. So support grassroots fundraising and organizing efforts around abortion funds, and lobby your elected officials at every level of government, but especially in the Senate.
This last question before we turn to student loan debt elimination. My reading of this draft opinion, which is based on the protection under the Due Process Clause of the Constitution, which of course was passed in order to at least begin to give full citizenship to formerly enslaved Black people. If this analysis is applied to other areas, I fear that it could lead to similar outcomes when it comes to everything from the ability of parents to make choices about how they raise their children, to the ability of people to marry whom they choose, regardless of their or their mate's race or sexual orientation or gender, the ability to access contraception. Do you share the concern that if this draft becomes the opinion of the court, that it's not just abortion that is at risk?
Certainly I do. And I would just remind the public, this is not a drill. This certainly has uh, the feasibility, uh, the possibility of setting very dangerous precedent. And again, on the issue of abortions more specifically, we know that these bans do not stop people from having abortions. And so if someone is not able to travel to a Massachusetts where they can access this care, if they just can't get here, we're putting their lives at risk. They just put safe, necessary care out of the reach of the most vulnerable. Again, specifically our lowest income sisters, our LGBTQ siblings, Black and Brown, AAPI, and Indigenous folks. So this is not a drill. The stakes could not be higher. If this ruling does become final, we know that more than half of the states across the country will move to ban abortion. And this is an important point, Kimberly, to what you were raising earlier around maternal health. A number of states propose bans that allow abortion incredibly early in a pregnancy, so early that many people wouldn't even be aware that they're pregnant. So this is just, it's incredibly dangerous. And I do fear for, the lives that are most vulnerable and that will be put at risk when they need this care, but also for the residual effects, the domino effect of the dangerous precedent that could be set here. But this is why, we continue to not, we know that we're often going to be met with obstruction in the Senate, or they're going to slow roll things, but we're not going to abdicate our responsibility to continue to lead and to fight and to move pieces of legislation, out of the House. But ultimately, this is why I'm working hard to grow our majority in the Senate. We need to grow that majority in the Senate of Democrats, and we need to ban the filibuster. So not only have we seen the Supreme Courts obstruct the will of the people when it comes to everything from voting rights to housing rights, to now reproductive justice and freedom and abortion, but we also see this filibuster, which is obstructing the will of the people in progress at every turn on everything from voting rights to gun reform to immigration reform. Leader Schumer did say earlier today that he will be moving to get this bill to the floor. And so, again, keep the pressure up, organize, raise your voices as if lives depend on it, because they do.
I want to turn now to another very important issue that you've been very vocal about, and that is student loan debt and its impact. One reason why I wanted to do a series on the racial wealth gap is because it's from my own experience. And not fully appreciating what the racial gap, wealth gap was. I thought it was something that didn't really affect me because I was doing okay. I thought it was something about people passing on wealth to their children. And it wasn't until I graduated from graduate school and was chatting with some mostly white friends of mine about the fact that I had this six-figure debt burden that started with a two, and a $35,000 a year job waiting for me, and how I couldn't even wrap my head around that amount of debt and what that could mean for my life. And I realized that I was alone. I couldn't commiserate with them because their families had absorbed that tuition debt. Um, I know that eliminating student loan debt is an important issue for you, and you have been urging the president to do that. Why do you think it is important for the president to act to eliminate student loan debt?
Well, Kimberly, this is a nearly $2 trillion crisis. I mean, in Massachusetts alone, we have some 855,000 federal borrowers. The average person is saddled with a minimum of $32,000 worth of debt, but again, most with much more than that. And throughout the pandemic, I've been leading this fight in the House, and we were successful in getting the administration to heed our calls to pause student loan payments during the pandemic. And we have heard from people that they've become first generation home buyers because they were able to redirect those funds. People remain safely housed, purchase essential goods. We find ourselves, not only, still, beginning to round the corner coming out of a pandemic, but still in very much in a pandemic induced recession. And so families are burdened. And so I see this as an effective strategy to boost our economy. And again, if we've seen how impactful this has been during the pandemic, imagine how transformational it would be if President Biden, by executive action, which requires no action by Congress, not a single vote, that he can, with a single act, the stroke of a pen, with the authority given to him by Congress, the same authority that was used to pause these student loan payments, he can, by executive action, cancel broad-based student debt. And we've been advocating for $50,000 because that will support 80% of those in the lowest income brackets. Kimberly, to your point, one of the things that I have found very frustrating, but we've made great strides due to the vigilance of this movement, is that there was a false narrative about who stands to benefit from student debt cancellation. It was a harmful narrative, a complete mischaracterization. People thought that it would be regressive in impact and only benefit white graduate students who attended affluent universities. And that is completely false. Myself, and you are like many Black students, 85% of whom had no choice but to borrow because of precise and discriminatory policies like redlining, which denied our families' ability to build generational wealth, or even going as far back as our families, African American veterans, not having equal access to the GI Bill. So our families were unable to build generational wealth. We borrow at higher rates. And then I was in keeping with the statistical average here, and that I defaulted on that loan. And Black borrowers are 5 times more likely to default on our loans. And Black women, in fact, are the most educated and bear the highest debt burden. So this is also a gender justice issue. 2/3 of this $2 trillion crisis is borne by women. And again, Black women owe 20% more than our white counterparts. So this is choking at the promise of our Commonwealth and our country. This is an economic justice issue. It will help to boost our economy as we in earnest begin the recovery from this pandemic-induced recession. And Kimberly, it's a racial justice issue. In fact, we've seen the presidents of historically Black colleges and universities use federal funds from the American Rescue Plan to cancel student debt. And we know that our HBCUs have been chronically and woefully underfunded. They have so many needs. And in all the ways that they could have been spending these federal funds, they've chosen instead to use it to cancel debt. So this is also a racial justice issue. And, I did ultimately, in recent years, pay those loans back, Kimberly, but I carried great shame about this debt because it wasn't as if I wasn't trying. It wasn't as if I wasn't gainfully employed. I just could not get ahead. and it affected my credit score, and everything else for many years.
And that is a story that is supported by the data, as I learned in reporting that piece. And the Emancipator series, like other pieces of it, are solutions focused. And one thing that I thought was very interesting is in speaking to one of the Morehouse students whose debt was eliminated in a surprise move at their graduation by Robert Smith, talked about the ways that it impacted his life. And what he talked about first wasn't himself or his career or how it will affect would have affected him, which it would have. He talked about his family. He talked about the fact that his mother did everything she could to ensure that her family was fed. And but for that change, but for the elimination of his student loan debt, she would be in debt. She would be carrying a debt burden through Parent Plus loans and other means for trying to help him get an education. And with that elimination, instead, he's going into investment banking, and now he's teaching her how to invest. And instead of debt, she has a portfolio. And how
Kimberly,
just that
thank you.
one difference, yeah, just the
Thank you for
transformative
making that
change
point.
of that.
Thank
Mhm.
you for making that point. And in fact, it underscores a point that I was remiss to make, and that this is an intergenerational crisis as well. So I've heard from so many parents who were in their upper 60s, early 70s, who were unable to retire because they have signed these Parent Plus loans. And so this is an intergenerational crisis. I have heard from parents who are still paying on their own loans and now absorbing the cost of their children as well. Kimberly, there's a whole generation of people who cannot, and of course, Black home ownership is the lowest it's been in 6 decades. But to start a business, to purchase a home, to even think about starting a family or growing a family. And then I have 76-year-olds in my district, 76, on fixed incomes, still paying student loans, and educators in Massachusetts who cannot afford the monthly minimum. We know the cost of living in Boston, specifically. And they took on this debt because they wanted to be educators. They wanted to pour into and build up our children. And some of them risk the penalty of losing their licensure because they cannot keep up with the monthly minimums. So when we say this debt is burdensome and that it is heavy, it is so heavy. And again, it is choking at the promise of this Commonwealth in our country. And the president can do something about it. And at a time when we see inflation because of corporate price gouging, because of conflicts abroad, we still see the incredibly high cost of childcare. We have the second highest cost of childcare in the country, $70,000 to $21,000 per child for center-based care. That's the equivalent of a state tuition cost, stagnant wages, rising rents. So this is the time. People keep talking about all of the inequities that were laid bare by this pandemic and how they've been worsened. Well, what are we going to do about it? We can't return to a pre-COVID status quo. So this is the opportunity to not only reverse and undo the harm that has been caused, but to chart a different path forward. And I see this as being a part of it. And the last thing that I would just say is that, people say that we live in a meritocracy. They told us that education is life's great equalizer, and they thought that by more Black folks pursuing higher education, that it would close the racial wealth gap, and it has in fact only widened it.
Yes, it has widened it. The two of the top criticisms that I've received, and I know that you must have heard this too, to this series, and specifically about student loans, are either A, as you mentioned, that it is regressive, it's going to reward people who, primarily professionals who are doctors and lawyers and who don't need it. And two, and more vocally, I hear, you know what, I went to school too and I paid my loans. So why should someone else get a break? That is fundamentally unfair. It is a giveaway. I believe the former Massachusetts governor compared it, questioned whether it would lead next to asking the government to pay credit card debt and car notes. What do you say to people who see this proposal to eliminate student loan debt not as a solution, but as a giveaway or an unfair payout?
Those are some very predictable, but no less infuriating talking points. I'm not sure when they went to school, but I would venture to guess it was not recently, because we have seen over these many decades the cost of higher education increase by 150%. Moreover, I did pay off my loans, and I have no qualms about that not being a burden that is then passed on to the next generation, or my 13-year-old daughter, as we talk about her future and where she might go to college and pursue higher education. I think that is the point. The next generation is supposed to do better. And so far as Black Americans, if we also have the layered systematic marginalization by living in banking deserts, being unbanked or underbanked, again, living in redline neighborhoods. So each of these things build upon the next. And so, as I said, people are very loose in their verbiage that we have found ourselves in the midst of a national reckoning on racial injustice and every inequity laid bare and worsened by the pandemic. I'm not quite sure we're in the reckoning yet. I think we're in an awakening, but the real reckoning will come through policies that I consider to be reparations. Everything from canceling student debt to actual reparations, to passing legislation like my baby bonds bill. These are the sorts of policies that we need to be advancing. The reckoning is about codifying the value of Black life in every policy and every budget. And so, that is the challenge, but also the opportunity before us in this moment. And, Kimberly, canceling student debt is transformative policy. It is responsive policy. It is sound policy, and it is also good politics. And the reason why we're championing this is for the direct impact that people will experience in their lives. Again, it's transformational, since it's an economic justice, racial justice issue, gender justice issue, and intergenerational issue. Again, a nearly $2 trillion crisis. It's impactful, but it's also responsive to the needs of the coalition of the most marginalized, which mobilized to deliver this democratic majority. And being in the majority must mean and be more than a talking point. This was a coalition which mobilized and delivered a decisive victory to this administration. And it was comprised of issues-based activists who were championing issues like canceling student debt, an issue that pundits and others tried to marginalize. And so I'm feeling very encouraged by the strength of this movement. The most recent letter that we sent to the White House advocating for broad-based student debt cancellation by executive action had 100 of my colleagues in the House and the Senate sign on to that letter. And some of them are from Democratic leadership. So the strength of this movement is strong. It has only grown. And we have done a good job at now telling the full and accurate story about who is burdened by this debt, who would benefit from it, and why the moment to act is now. President Biden has the authority, same authority given to him through Congress by the Higher Education Act, to pause those student loan payments, can and must be used for student debt cancellation. And I'm encouraged that he has offered verbal indicators that this is something that he is considering in earnest, and he will be canceling some debt.
And on that, as you said, the data supports that measures like student debt cancellation will positively impact those who need it most. But in the same vein, in response to a lot of the criticism that I get about this being framed as reparations, although it is an issue of racial justice, one point that I point out, particularly for people who say how hard they've had to work and how difficult they've had it, is whether it's student loan elimination or repairing the credit reporting system or increasing access to business capital, usually the policies that are being proposed would also help struggling white people. It's not just directly directed only at Black people. And so when we're talking about reparations, it is not that pointed. Can just in the last moment or two we have left, can you talk about how it impacts the lives of the people who need it most, not just Black and brown folks?
Absolutely. Again, when we uplift the most marginalized, everyone stands to benefit from that. And that's true for any issue. If we root out the barriers, the systemic racial biases in our healthcare system, so that more Black women can give birth without near fatal or fatal outcomes, everyone stands to benefit from that. The entire healthcare system, the entire maternal health system. And the same is true for student debt. As I said, we've been advocating for broad-based student debt cancellation at $50,000 because that will support burden alleviation for 80% of those in the lowest income brackets. So that's not just Black folk. And I think it's also important to note, Kimberly, that 40% of those who have student debt don't even have a degree. And so, right, we have seen some strides be made because of our advocacy and because of those who were adversely impacted for restoration for those victimized by deceptive business practices and the predatory marketing of our for-profit colleges and universities, again, which are overwhelmingly low-income people and people of color who were not seeking a hand out, they were simply seeking a hand up and were moving according to, again, the narratives of this meritocracy, which we purport, that if you want to be more competitive and be able to better provide for your family, then more education is the route. And so you have 40% of people who have been burdened by this debt, affecting their credit score, their ability to secure housing or gainful employment. And they might not even have a certificate that enables them to even be more competitive in the job market. I mean, and if they do have one, it's not worth all that they had to sacrifice and to experience. And so, again, there have been strides. There's been forgiveness for disabled borrowers, for veterans, public service loan forgiveness. And again, for those who have been victimized by for-profit colleges and universities, which is an issue that I've been working on since I was on the Boston City Council. But we need broad-based student debt cancellation. The president has the authority to do it. The American people are hurting, and we should be doing everything possible while in the midst of this recovery from a pandemic-induced recession, while families are experiencing the burden of inflation because of corporate price gouging and conflicts abroad, doing everything possible to eliminate a bill and to alleviate their hardship and their burden. He has the authority, just do it.
Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts, thank you so much for joining us today for this fireside chat.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone in our audience for joining us as well. Be sure to check out The Emancipator at theemancipator.org for the Racial Wealth Gap series and much, much more. Thank you all for joining us today.